Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I am here with my April wrap-up. The first book I finished was Binti Home by Nnedi Okorafor. This is the second book in the Binti novella trilogy. We mainly follow Binti as she comes home. She returns home after the events of the first novella, and we really see as she struggles to adjust compared to the new experiences she has had that have really changed her or made her see herself differently as a person. I think the exploration of culture and family history and how that intersects with you as an individual, and especially after you've had very powerful or very dramatic experiences, how those things can clash. Because Binti still loves her family and her people and her culture, but we see that some of them are maybe not ready to accept this kind of new version of herself. She has PTSD from the events of the first book, and we see her go to a therapist and use kind of like breathing techniques and anti-anxiety techniques. So we actually see the consequences of this dramatic and very traumatic thing that happened in the first book. And I feel like that's something that gets glossed over a lot in science fiction or fantasy, and I gave it 4 stars. Next, I finished Transformed: The Perils of the Frog Prince by Megan Morrison. This is the third and most recent book in the Time series, and as you can probably guess, this is a retelling of The Frog Prince. So we follow our main character Syra as he tries to get turned back into a human, but along the way he gets tangled up in some kind of like election politics, which sounds really boring, but it's actually very dramatic and interesting. Megan Morrison, I think, does a fantastic job of integrating real-world issues into her fantasy books. So in this one, we deal a lot with politics and elections and kind of elected figures, types of government and kind of the responsibility they have to the people they govern, in addition to things like GMOs. And there's just a lot of really great material in here about issues that are very relevant today. I was actually surprised by some of the kind of reveals or like developments, because there is also kind of a mystery going on that incorporates all of those things, like those political things. And I absolutely loved Syra's character development. He starts out like such a selfish asshole, but by the end I really loved him, and I feel like his development was done so seamlessly. Like there wasn't any like big dramatic shift. Like there wasn't a chapter where I'm like, okay, so now he's a good guy. It was so subtle and gradual, and for that reason it felt really believable and really earned. I was really enjoying the book, and I was probably sitting at like a 4.5, but then, as has happened with every Megan Morrison book I've read so far, I get to the end, and the end just hits me so emotionally in a way that I wasn't expecting, and I ended up giving it 5 stars. Next, I finished Starry River of the Sky by Grace Lin. This is an Own Voices Chinese-inspired fantasy, and this is just such a beautiful book. So we follow our main character Rendi, and he has run away from home, and he ends up in this inn, basically, and he kind of stays and assists the innkeeper, and we see some of the guests of the inn, and there are a few in particular that become really important supporting characters, and it's really a story about him sort of getting drawn into this found family and like this circle of people who care about him, because Rendi is pretty bitter and antisocial at the beginning, and he makes it very clear that he doesn't want to be here. He's just stopping by and he'll be on his way soon. But somehow he just keeps getting delayed, and it's just such a good story about friendship and about the power of storytelling. I really, really love the way that stories and folklore were incorporated into this book. And another thing that I just loved is not only do you have these really bright and lovely like chapter headers, but there are these absolutely stunning full color illustrations that are scattered throughout the book that are also drawn by Grace Lin herself. I just really enjoyed this. I gave this one 5 stars as well. The only thing that I was a little questionable on is there's a lot of talk about families and family relationships, and there was one in particular that I feel like through our like real world lens, I think it could be considered a pretty unhealthy one, like verbally abusive even. I don't think that's what the author was going for, but I think that could have been made clearer that that wasn't what was happening. Next, I finished The Tea Dragon Society by Katie O'Neill, and thank you so much, Priscilla. She sent this to me for my birthday. We follow our main character Greta, and she is kind of drawn into this world and this society of tea dragons, and tea dragons are basically what they sound like. They're little tiny adorable dragons that grow tea leaves on their backs, and it's a lot of work to care for them, so the art of caring for them and making tea from them is sort of dying out, but she kind of gets involved in that, and she meets some other characters along the way, and this was just so charming and whimsical and lovely, and I just really enjoyed it. I'll show you an example of the art. I just love the colors and the brightness. The story itself I did really like. There's a ton of diversity in this graphic novel. Several queer characters, many characters of color, so that was really great as well. And the only thing about the story that I was a tiny bit disappointed in is I was expecting more about the dragons themselves, and we do get kind of a guide to the dragons at the very back of the graphic novel, which I really loved. I just would have liked to see the dragons incorporated more, because it ended up being more about Greta making friends through the Society of Tea Dragons versus like the actual dragons themselves. Regardless though, I did still adore this and I give it 4.5 stars. Next, I finished Night Music by Jen Marie Thorne. So we follow our main character Ruby Chertok, and she is the daughter of a very famous composer. Her whole family is incredibly musically talented. They're famous for that. And over the summer, this boy Oscar is staying with her father to kind of study under him and be trained by him. Ruby has a lot going on with her own insecurities about her musical abilities, and Oscar is black and he's really worried about how it's going to appear to people if he gets involved with the white daughter of his kind of sponsor or instructor. Like he's worried that people are going to make assumptions about that. The two of them end up forming a friendship that eventually turns into a romance. The things I loved were some of the social issues that were handled in this book, like the fact that classical music, which Oscar is pursuing, is a very, very white dominated field still today, and the difficulties that he faces as a black person breaking into that, even with his immense abilities and talent. Ruby ends up kind of reconnecting with one of her old friends from when they were younger, and I did not like her at first, but she ended up being one of my favorite parts of the book, honestly. And I also like the fact that even though Ruby and her family are very social justice oriented, she still makes mistakes that Oscar or other characters will like call her on. So she's portrayed as a good person, but somebody who's not flawless, you know? She does make mistakes, she does make assumptions that she has to either call herself on or somebody else will call her out about it. Then there are some things about this book that I think could be pluses or minuses for you depending on what you are looking for. So this is set in New York City, and I thought that was like an okay part of this book. I'm not like especially drawn to books set in New York, but I know some people are. I don't feel like it went too over the top with it, but there were a couple of times where it's like, I'm sure this bakery that they're talking about for like 6 pages means a lot if you're from New York City, but you know, that kind of thing. And then the other thing about like the music itself, this is obviously a book that's very heavily, it very heavily incorporates music, especially classical music, as a theme. Music is not like one of my biggest passions or anything, but I do like it enough that I connected with this book, especially the classical music part and like certain pieces or composers and the way they talked about certain sounds. I did really like that. And another thing that would depend on your preference is Oscar and Ruby's relationship gets pretty intense pretty quickly, and not in like an unhealthy way or anything, but it just becomes like a huge part of these characters' lives. It is understandable, you know, they're both pretty intense people and the circumstances that they're in and everything. Like I did still believe their relationship and their chemistry, but it was a lot. I feel like in the end, maybe this book tried to do just a little bit too much, because there were some things at the end, like these character turnarounds, that I did not feel were earned at all. Like I feel like we just brushed over Ruby's experiences in a way because of how some characters were kind of, it's like we're supposed to forgive them for everything they did, and it's like, well, I don't. Another thing I really didn't like is Ruby is really struggling with what she wants to do in her life. She's really searching for her purpose and trying to figure out what she's going to do if she's not going to be a musician, because this is literally her family's whole life. And those parts, well, I felt like they were very emotional and I could really feel what Ruby was feeling. I felt a lot of sympathy for her because of how well that struggle was described. I think in the end, it felt almost unimportant by the end of the book. Ruby tries multiple things in order to try and like find her calling, what she wants to do with her life. And one of the things she tries, it seems like it's a huge deal for her, and then it doesn't work out, and she's like devastated for a couple pages, and then that's it. We never hear about it again. It's like it didn't affect her at all. And I found that really unbelievable, especially given the way that certain other characters responded to her. Like, I think they got off the hook a little too easily. And I also got kind of annoyed by the writing style of this book, especially early on. It's very quick almost, and like not choppy or anything. It kind of reminded me of one of those patter songs, if you've ever heard from like musicals, where it's just like thought after thought after thought, and it's like very quick to read, which was nice, but it got grating because it felt very repetitive after a while, like the same rhythm and the same use of commas and like short sentences and like sentence structure and everything. I ended up giving Night Music 3.5 stars. Next, I finished Sleepless, Volume 1 by Sarah Vaughan, Lila Del Duca, Elisa Sala, and Daron Bennett. And thank you so much to my friend Amy for sending this to me actually for Christmas last year. So we follow our main characters Poppy and Cyril for the most part, and Poppy is a lady or a princess, and Cyril is her bodyguard, and he is a sleepless, which means, as it sounds, he can't sleep. They're sort of like, they like take this vow that turns them into these sort of like magical creatures. There are several attempts on Poppy's life, and Cyril and her and some of the other characters are trying to figure out who is doing this, try to stop them, and try to figure out like why this is happening, basically, like why, like how this fits into kind of the larger conflict, you know, between different countries or kingdoms. And I thought this was fantastic. I love the exploration of the different cultures. I think the world building was fantastic. The art was just stunning. I think this is one of my favorite styles I have ever come across. Like, it's just so beautiful. Kind of a muted color palette, but I just really, really loved the style of this. I also really liked our main characters. I really, really loved Poppy especially. She's such an interesting character. She has such a strong personality, but she also knows when to kind of pick her battles, and I really admired that. I admired her strength and her intelligence, and I also really liked Cyril. Their relationship was just really, really wonderful. Like, there's definitely this underlying kind of romantic tension between them because they have been so close for so long, and we really see them like struggling with that and kind of trying to ignore it, and it was just great. I loved this. I give it 5 stars. I'm definitely excited for the second volume. Next, I finished Brazen, Rebel Ladies Who Rocked the World by Penelope Baggio. And thank you so much to my friend Trisha for giving this to me for Christmas last year. I mentioned in my TBR for this month that I was reading a lot of like gifted books to kind of like celebrate my birthday, so that's why there's so many here. And this is a graphic novel style like feminist nonfiction book about all of these different important and interesting and powerful women from history. And I loved this. Once again, I loved the art style, but especially the full color illustrations. The comic style itself was also fun. I loved the variety of women we got here. There are some modern women that the book talked about, some obviously from much further back in history. There were some that I recognized and some that I didn't, so I loved getting to know more about important women that I hadn't heard of before. My one caveat, and the reason I gave it 4.5 stars instead of 5 stars, is because there were a couple places where I feel like the author was kind of judgmental about like the kind of woman you were supposed to be, which didn't really fit in with the tone of this book overall, because I do think like there was a fantastic variety of different kinds of strength in women. There was one line where she kind of implied that everyone in the movie industry is automatically stupid, which felt very out of place in this book. And so just like a couple things like that that I didn't like that made me kind of like uncomfortable, but other than that, I do think this is fantastic. Next, I read Defy the Stars by Claudia Gray. This is the first book in the Constellation trilogy, I think it's called, and this is actually a reread. This is a science fiction novel, and we follow 2 main characters, Noemi Vidal and an android-type mech named Abel, and they are on opposite sides of this kind of galactic war. They end up having to team up, and we follow them on their adventures across the galaxy, and I really love this book. This is definitely a more character-focused science fiction, so even though it is very fast-paced in a lot of places, it's really more about how much you connect to the characters and the character relationships and things like that. If you like these characters, I think you'll like the book, and that's what happened with me. I actually really appreciated that we didn't spend huge amounts of time on like the nitty-gritty details of like the spaceships and things like that, but if you're a hardcore science fiction fan, that might annoy you. I liked it. And I also really like the themes of this book, kind of like the characters struggle with what makes somebody a human and like what is our place in the world and the galaxy and everything. And we especially see Noemi struggle with what she's been taught as like a member of this army with what she has come to experience. Like, is Abel actually a person? You know, like, should she treat him like a human being and things like that? And that's a theme in science fiction that I tend to really be drawn to and to really enjoy, like this question of like technically people that are not really humans, but like they are, you know? I'm doing a really bad job explaining this. I know I basically haven't told you anything about the plot, but honestly, I don't know how much I should give away about the story, so I will leave that up to you and your Goodreads searching. Next, I finished Voices, The Final Hours of Joan of Arc by David Elliott. This is a novel in verse about Saint Joan of Arc, and specifically told through poetry that is written as if from the perspectives of people and even objects around her. And I really enjoyed this. I know some people really didn't like the fact that the author used rhyme so much, but I think it was actually pretty effective, especially in the early part of the book. I actually really liked some of the poems and the repetition and the way he used rhyme. He used a lot of different styles of poetry that would have been used at the time of Joan of Arc, which I thought was really cool. There were a couple where the rhyme got to be a little bit too sing-song, a little too much, but I think for the most part, you could read them in such a way that you could appreciate the rhyme and the construction of the poem while also not being overwhelmed by it or distracted by it or feeling like it was annoying. There were some poems in particular that I thought were just really powerful or really beautiful. I really liked Joan, the way she was characterized herself. She's a historical figure that I am really interested in. I love St. Joan of Arc. There were some things I didn't think were done as well, like some of the characterization choices that David Elliott made about some of the other perspectives in this book I didn't really agree with. Like, I feel like they were kind of odd. And I also feel like as the book went on, I didn't have as many poems near the end of the novel that I loved as that I did at the beginning. And I don't know why that is, if he changed his style a little bit or if it was just the subject matter or what. But another thing I really liked about this book is the way that he incorporates segments from her trial, because we have a complete transcript of the trial of Joan of Arc and of the trial where they basically absolve her after her death. And I think he used those really well. And so I would overall really recommend this despite the couple of hang-ups I had, and I gave Voices 4 stars. Next, I finished A Pinch of Magic by Michelle Harrison. This is a book about 3 sisters who are under this kind of family curse, and there are also these magical objects that they come into possession of, and we follow them as they go on an adventure to try and break the curse before it's too late. Basically. I was so disappointed in this book. The story only happens because literally every single character made the stupidest possible decision every chance they got. It's like the author was writing this book and she was like, how do I write believably from a younger kid's perspective? I know, I'll make them dumb. Kids are dumb, right? Like, that's kind of what it felt like to me, and I'm sure that's not what she did, but just all of these characters were so stupid. And like, I understand young kids make mistakes. They're not going to be as like, I don't know, analytical as older people would be. But the things that she had these kids do, it's like, it was nonsensical. It only happened because that was the way to get us to the next plot point. And not even like the younger characters, but like the adults also made dumb decisions. The like older teens made dumb decisions. Everyone in this book was a colossal idiot, basically, and I couldn't stand it. I also feel like the sister relationships weren't that well developed. All of the characters felt, like the 3 sister characters, felt very flat and stereotypical. Like, you have the oldest one who's the pretty one who's obsessed with boys. You have the middle one who's plain but adventurous. And you have the younger one who's like really precocious and she's supposed to be adorable, but she's just freaking irritating. It didn't feel like they really cared about each other until something bad happened, and then it was like, oh, why didn't I appreciate my sister? And like, I understand that that's probably how some people experience that, you know, like maybe families that aren't close, something bad will happen and they'll realize that they do care about each other. But the way it was done just felt so shallow in this book, because it felt like the book was trying to convince us that they had loved each other all along, and it really didn't feel like that. And on top of that, like, the ending, like, there were some things I liked about it, but for the most part, the ending was also really frustrating and just dissatisfying and not fun to read about. 2.75 stars. Next, I finished Dear Martin by Nick Stone. This is a book about a black teenager named Justice, and he starts writing letters as if he's writing to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. after he has an experience with police brutality that really changes him and affects how he sees the world. And so he starts writing these letters as a way to try and cope with that and to figure out what he wants to do about it. And I had a lot of mixed feelings about this book. I think the way that we saw Justice explore his own kind of changing opinions on how bad things are in America based on his own experiences, I think that was done really well. And there were also a couple of conversations that happened in one of his classes that where like various characters just kind of shut down ignorant, bigoted people. That was really satisfying to read. So there were definitely things this book did really well. I just feel like the execution of some of it was not as good or not as effective as it could have been. I found the writing of this kind of confusing or unnecessary, like some of the stylistic choices. There are huge chunks of the book that take place in like script format for no apparent reason. And that was really jarring, and sometimes even it would be like normal dialogue and then abruptly the next line would like switch into script format for like a couple paragraphs or pages even. And I don't feel like that was, like, I don't know why that happened. I felt like it made the writing feel very choppy. I also feel like scene changes were really choppy as well. Like, there were so many times in this book where we would suddenly cut to something happening like a few weeks later, and I wouldn't realize that we had changed time frames until I'd read like a couple pages and I was just completely confused. There's also a somewhat strong romantic subplot in this book, and given how short it is, I don't feel like that was developed super well. Even though I liked the character who was his romantic interest, I don't feel like we got the time with her that that we should have had in order to really like get invested in their relationship. I think the premise of writing letters to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I also feel like that wasn't incorporated as much as I expected it to be. I feel like they functioned almost exactly the same as regular diary entries would have for the most part. There were times when Justice would connect something that happened to him with something that Dr. King had experienced, and I thought that was interesting, but I would have liked to see more of that. Considering that the book is sort of built on that premise, I don't feel like it was used very much. And then the last thing I want to say is that the ending of this book, in some ways, I don't feel like we saw it earned the way we should have. I was really surprised by it. And even though it was a better surprise about how people can change and there's more to people than meets the eye, I still feel like we didn't spend enough time on that character or that change to really justify it happening. So even though I liked the way it ended, I'm still sort of dissatisfied by it. I do think this is a really important book. I'm not like steering people away from it by any means, but there were just a lot of things about the execution that made the message and the important topic less effective because of the way it was written. So I ended up giving Dear Martin 3 stars. Next, I realized it was National Poetry Month, so I figured I should probably read some poetry, and I picked up Every Riven Thing by Christian Wyman. I had come across a couple of his poems before and really enjoyed them, so I thought I would check out a full collection of his, and I did really like this overall. It's really hard for me to describe poetry, but I like the way that even though his subject matter and the tone of a lot of his work is kind of bleak feeling, it's ultimately not. Some of his poetry deals with the fact that he has been diagnosed with cancer and the way that changes the way he approaches the world and life and everything. But even though there are definitely some really melancholy poems, I don't feel like overall it's a depressing collection. There are enough sparks of hope in it that I didn't feel like drained when I finished this. I did like his shorter poems best. I feel like that's the way that his style works best for me. I ended up giving this 4 stars because even though the majority of the poems were like solid, maybe 3.5 stars, there were enough that I absolutely loved and that really like made me stop and think and I would come back to, and I ended up bumping it up to 4 stars. Some of my favorite poems were This Mind of Dying, 2047 Grace Street, Now When There Is No Now to Burn, and Gone for the Day, She Is the Day. And I'm just going to read like a really short segment from that one to kind of give you a feeling for his style. To love is to feel your death given to you like a sentence, to meet the judge's eyes as if there were a judge, as if he had eyes, and love. So kind of that mix of really sad but also like a little kernel of hope. Next, I finished The Sisters of the Winter Wood by Raina Rossner. This is an Own Voices Jewish-inspired fantasy that's sort of a loose retelling of the Goblin Market story. And we follow 2 girls, Liba and Leia. Their parents leave, and after their parents leave, everything kind of falls apart, and Leia, the younger sister, gets involved with these mysterious, like, sinister men who Liba doesn't trust, and things kind of go on from there. This is another really disappointing book for me, but first I really want to direct you to my friend Huck's review. She did a really fantastic review and discussion of this book where she talks about the things that she liked about it, the things that she felt like just weren't very good, like story-wise, like as a book it didn't execute very well, and then also some things about the Jewish representation that, despite the fact that this is Own Voices, things that are actually like quite negative and stereotypical. So please go and check that video out. It's fantastic. One of the sisters, Laya, her perspective is always told in verse, but it doesn't really feel like verse. It just feels like normal writing that's just a little bit more stream of consciousness than normal prose. So that was just, I just feel like that was unnecessary. Another problem I had was that the actual fairy and like Goblin Market stuff of this book, it's very light on that. And I feel like this book is really set up as like a folklore kind of fairy tale story. And considering that, there's really not a lot of actual Goblin Market like magic type things. I feel like there's also quite a few plot holes in this story. Like, for example, why did these girls' parents tell each of them only like half of the information that they needed to know? I just don't understand that. Each sister knew just enough to get her into trouble, not enough to make informed decisions or to try and prevent any of the bad stuff from happening. And I don't know why that happened except to prolong the story. I also really didn't like the way that the sisters were characterized in their shapeshifting. So Liba has the power to transform into a bear, and her younger sister Laya, who's of course the beautiful blonde one, has the ability to transform herself into a swan. And the way that is characterized is just like really, I think, unfortunate. And again, I direct you to Huck's review for how that really relates to portrayals of Jewish characters and stereotypes in particular, but also just from a more general like characterization standpoint. One of the huge warnings that Liba is developing this power is that she's hungry and that she starts like craving raw meat. So she eats raw meat, and that's one of the warning signs that she is like going to be turning into a bear soon. And while that is like disgusting, the fact that she is really hungry is portrayed in a way that makes it seem almost as bad as the fact that she just gulped down like raw bloody meat. And I had an issue with that. And it's not even like she's eating a ridiculous amount. It's like she's hungry at dinner, so she eats fast. And even though some of the more likable characters didn't have a problem with it, and you know, like that is kind of addressed in the way that they're like, oh, that's not a bad thing. The way the book shows it, it still makes it feel like this is a shameful thing that like Liba enjoys food and is hungry and wants to eat. and I didn't like that. I gave this 2 stars. I don't really recommend it. Next, I finished another poetry collection, and that is A Thousand Mornings by Mary Oliver. I really love the clarity of her writing. Her poems don't just bring you a sense of peace or like joy in the world, although they do, and I think that's important. They also like make me really think about how I view certain things about life, I guess. But a couple of my favorites are Blake Dying, On Traveling to Beautiful Places. I could probably come up with a lot more, but I just really enjoyed this collection. And just as an example of how I think she really beautifully incorporates simplicity and depth, here's a poem called The Gardener. Have I lived enough? Have I loved enough? Have I considered right action enough? Have I come to any conclusion? Have I experienced happiness with sufficient gratitude? Have I endured loneliness with grace? I say this, or perhaps I'm just thinking it. Actually, I probably think too much. Then I step out into the garden, where the gardener, who is said to be a simple man, is tending his children, the roses. Again, poetry, a very personal thing. Some people don't really get along with her style. They say it's too simplistic and that anyone could write it. I disagree, but anyway, I loved it. 5 stars. Next, I read A Confession by Leo Tolstoy. I've been wanting to try some of Tolstoy's work, but before I jump into his bricks, I thought I would try some of his like really short nonfiction and see how I got along with it. So this is a really interesting blend of philosophy and theology and memoir and just like a bunch of other things. It's about Tolstoy's life and about how his view of the world changed. Really hard to describe. This is something that was a very like personal reading experience for me. So I think that if it's not something that you are specifically looking for, you might read this and not be that affected or impressed, might think like it was fine. But I loved this. Before I get into my review, I do want to give a content warning, a huge trigger warning for suicide and like suicidal thoughts and actions and everything. This was written about a very bleak time in Tolstoy's life, and he's very honest about how bad things were. I don't know if I've ever actually read anything that was this focused on suicidal thought and depression. But as far as the writing goes, I found his style to be very easy to get through. I feel like it was the perfect blend of conversational and clever, and I just really enjoyed the way he wrote. This translation is by Jane Kentish, so partial credit to her for that, I guess. I just found this a really powerful book. There were a lot, I think, of really good insights. There's a part at the end about religious tolerance that I found very, very affecting and very good. I really enjoyed seeing his perspective, and I gave it 5 stars. Next, I finished No Good Deed by Kara Connolly. This is sort of a loose Robin Hood retelling, and I really, really enjoyed this. We follow our main character, Ellie, and she is an archer. She's got the skills to be in the Olympics, but she hasn't made it yet. And she has a lot of kind of family strife going on to a certain extent. She's kind of always felt like she's in the shadow of her brother, who was an Olympic medalist and who achieved all of these things, and now he's off, I think he's in the Peace Corps maybe, so he's doing these amazing humanitarian things as well, and Ellie kind of feels like she's never going to be good enough, so she has that going on, and then she gets transported back in time to the time of Robin Hood. I really liked Ellie, our main character. I thought she was really like spunky and funny, and I feel like she was very believable as a 21st century person getting transported back in time. She was really smart about it. She like tried to stay out of trouble, but I think her kind of breaking point was also believable. Like there were a couple of places where like she like kept her head down because she knew that she was not in her world, and then there were a couple of places where she's like, I'm sorry, this is ridiculous, you're gonna cut off someone's hand, like what? This is unacceptable, how is everyone okay with this? And she was really fun to follow, and I also really enjoyed seeing her kind of get to know her own personality, because now that she's out of the shadow of her brother, she's like several hundred years away from him. It was really interesting seeing her like discover what kind of person she was. I really loved some of the side characters in this book, even the ones that like I wasn't as much of a fan of. But at the end of the book, I just loved this whole group of like, ragtag friends / allies / merry men. I don't know, it was just like really fun. I also feel like the historical stuff was done pretty well, and there were enough like accurate things or jokes about it that I didn't mind some of the inaccuracies. Like the style that they spoke in kind of went back and forth between being more or less like period appropriate, but there was also this like kind of running joke about how everybody had a hard time with everyone else's accent. Like people would tell Ellie like, you're so bad at English, you're not even speaking English. Meanwhile, she's having so much trouble understanding this like Middle English accent these people are using. So that was just really fun. I really enjoyed the humor of this book overall and Ellie's kind of narration, but there were a couple of places where I felt like it got a little too over the top, I don't know, it felt forced. Also the ending, it's this really weird mix of satisfying and dissatisfying, and I'm still working out how I feel about it, but I ended up giving No Good Deed 4 stars. Next, I finished Sherwood by Megan Spooner, and shout out to my lovely friend Giselle for basically telling me that I had to read this so we could talk about it, because I don't know when I would have gotten to this otherwise, and I freaking loved this. So this is another Robin Hood retelling. In this one, we follow Maid Marian as the main character, and Robin is actually killed while fighting in the Crusades. And then Marian sort of accidentally, but then purposefully, takes on the persona of Robin Hood. So she gets involved in like helping people and like helping the poor and all of this. And yeah, like I said, I absolutely adored this, but this is another one I'm gonna have a hard time reviewing and recommending because I can see this being a very polarizing book. I loved Marian as a main character. I found her so well written, so complex. I really feel like the emotional intensity of what she was going through was communicated really well to the reader. Like her grief at losing Robin and how that affected other parts of her life, and just kind of her changing feelings about who she is and about how she relates to other characters. I just feel like that complexity, that emotional complexity and everything was just handled and described so beautifully. I also really liked a lot of the side characters. The female friendship were so well crafted, even the ones that we don't see a lot of. I just really loved them. I love that the whole not like other girls thing is challenged, because like never once does Marian look down on women who are more traditionally feminine. Like there are reasons that she doesn't feel comfortable in that clothing or in that role or whatever, but she never thinks of herself as being like more important or more intelligent or like anything, like a better woman or a better person than any of these other women. And I just loved that. That's something we still don't see enough of in books, but I loved how that was done here. So now a couple of the things that I think will make this a very like hit or miss book for people. The way that Megan Spooner incorporates the Robin Hood mythology into her book and into her twist and like Marian as the central character, I thought that was done beautifully, and I just thought it was brilliant, honestly. I can see it disappointing some people, especially considering your preferences for Robin Hood retellings, how much you love the original or how much you know about the original. I went into this like ready to be surprised about any of it. So I really liked how it was used. And then there's also a romantic relationship in this book that I think it'll really work for some people and really not work. It could be a huge turnoff for people. I personally was like really amazed and impressed at how believable she made it, about how well developed it was, and like it made sense to me, but again, might not work for other people. You can already tell that this is a pretty polarizing book, because when I looked at the Goodreads reviews, most or all of the top rated ones were like 5 stars or like 2 stars and DNFs. And I can definitely understand how some of the story elements won't work for people, but something I do want to address that I do have an issue with is I've been seeing some people who didn't like this book call it anti-feminist because of some things about the way the story wraps up, and I do have a really big issue with that, because I'm not gonna give spoilers for what happens, but the choices that Marian makes, they're her decisions, they're what makes her happy, and they are consistent with her character and her wishes that we have seen throughout the book. So like, how much more feminist could you get than like women getting to choose what they want to do about their lives? Like obviously people are free to like or dislike an ending. I complain about endings of books all the time, but I don't think it's fair to say that an ending is anti-feminist just because you didn't like how it ended. So yeah, I loved it. If I had one complaint about this book, it's that there were a couple of places where I wanted it to move a little faster, but I don't think it's because the book was too slow. Like I didn't feel like it was slow. I think I was just impatient because I was loving the book so much. I wanted to like keep loving it, if that made sense. This was 5 out of 5 stars for me. This was like 460 something pages, and I finished it in like a day, and I got to the end and it's like, I wish it was longer. So adored this. Don't know who to recommend it for. I feel like overall this wrap up was very much like me struggling to describe things or to recommend things or to give you any helpful information about a book, and I am really sorry. If you stuck it out to the end, thank you so much. Let me know if you guys have read any of these books, what you thought of them, if we agree, if we disagree. I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!